This is the first of a series of short videos about the role of government in microeconomic models. The textbook introduces the government and talks about the role in perfectly competitive models in Chapter 9 after studying in Chapter 8, and then continues to touch on the role of government in Chapters 10 through 12, where it talks about monopolies, monopolistic competition, and oligopolies. So instead of covering those there, what I've done is just group all of the government intervention and the role of government kind of stuff into one module at the end. I think it summarizes pretty well just overall the models that we've gone through in the class. Right, so we'll study in this class these models kind of more from a theoretic perspective. There's some pretty good classes in the department about the role of government and taxation. And really, I think my goal is to just get you set up to where if you took one of those classes, you would understand the basic models where those kind of taxation problems and redistribution problems are coming from. So the first basic model that we studied in this course back in midterm 1 was the consumer's problem. We studied the individual consumer as market being the sum we then describe the market demand as being the sum of individuals. So first we study the consumer's problem, which is depicted here. You've got this budget constraint, which is linear, and you've got preferences illustrated by this set of indifference curves. Right, so in the consumer's problem, the consumer is trying to maximize utility, and we see the utility maximization at point A. Right, so just for review, suppose the consumer has $100 to spend on good X and Y. We have prices of X and prices of Y. What is the consumer's budget constraint? Well, we know in general, income equals PXX plus PYY, which means 100 equals 3X plus 5Y. We have $100 to spend. There's no role of savings in this model. So we can spend it on either X, which costs $3, or Y, which costs 5. All right, so what is the role of taxes? Well, generally speaking, these simple models don't really have government built in, and so there isn't going to be specifically a role for the government in the models, but we know in general the government might want to collect income tax or tax certain products sold locally to fund public programs and services like schools, roads, parks, hospitals, fire and police, sewage, and so on. All right, so we're going to see what would happen if we have some sort of tax in the market, like say an income tax. An income tax would just act to shift the budget constraint, right? Because we've got some sort of certain income, right? And then we spend it on X or Y at these given prices. So in this example, we say, suppose a consumer has $100 to spend on X and Y and is taxed at the rate of 10%. If X costs $3 and Y costs $5, what is the taxed budget constraint? Well, it doesn't impact the price of X or Y, an income tax. We just reduce income by the amount of the tax. So $100 times 1 minus 10%, or $100 times 90% is $90 remaining after tax, which we can spend on X or Y at the given prices. All right, so as a result of the income tax, we see a leftward shift in the budget constraint. We see a new consumer optimum at a lower level of utility. All right, but at this new budget constraint, given the lower taxed income, the consumer is no longer able to afford point A, and the income effect shifts us onto a new indifference curve, a new lower indifference curve. In this model, again, there's really no role for the tax revenue, so we have to assume that it's just thrown out or wasted. And so we see that this tax on the consumer would not be welfare improving. The consumer is consuming less. In order for the tax to be potentially welfare improving, we need some sort of redistribution, or for the tax revenue to be used to subsidize one of the goods, something like that. You would find a good analysis of that in Econ 425 and a couple of our other courses, which are on public economics and tax. So again, I'm just kind of getting you set up with the basic models so that if you took a course like this, you would be able to look at a taxation problem and kind of understand the basic model from where that's coming from. All right, just in general, so again, we don't have any sort of redistribution, but we could have the government collect some amount of tax and then redistribute it back lump sum. So you get this term plus G, or it said we could use it to say subsidize one of the products. So, that would result in a price decrease if we were subsidizing X, right? You pay this tax, but then you only pay PX minus some amount, PX minus S, the amount of the subsidy. All right, so again, we're not really going to get into that level of detail. I'm not going to ask you mathematical questions about that type of stuff, but I just kind of want to point you in the direction of where you can make these government intervention models a little bit more detailed or maybe a little bit closer to reality. Again, we're just kind of studying the simple models from where they come from. So we haven't given any thought to this point what goods X and Y are. Suppose good X is potentially harmful either to the consumer or to the environment. And the example I've chosen is single-use plastic straws. So the consumer faces the choice between plastics at a price, one-use plastics at a price PX, or reusable bottles at a price PY. Also assume single-use plastics are damaging to the environment, so the government just wants to find a way to limit the consumption. So we showed one thing that it could do is tax income because it results in the consumption of less of everything. But if we wanted the government to specifically shift consumption along the same indifference curve without reducing welfare, one possibility might be to specifically tax, in this case, single-use plastics. All right, so in general, what would happen if we taxed one particular good? Here we've got our budget constraint. Now we're not going to change income. We're just placing a tax on one particular good. In this case, it's going to be good X, or the single-use plastics, which effectively increases the price consumers pay for the single-use plastics. Right, so remember that the slope of this budget line is PX over PY, and now we've effectively changed PX. So we've effectively changed the slope of the budget constraint. So it's not a parallel shift of the budget constraint, but rather just a rotation. It effectively increases the price of one good, changes the slope, rotates the budget constraint. And what can we expect? So I didn't put the picture here because in chapter 4, we did a lot of this sort of analysis of what happens if we change the price of one good, rotate the budget constraint, what's the new optimum, and then we did like income and substitution effect. So if you're feeling a little a bit lost on that, go back into chapter 4, take a look at those videos and material. Feel free to ask me some questions. But we've got this relative price change. It rotates the budget constraint. And generally speaking, what we can expect is that the consumer should respond by consuming less of the relatively more expensive taxed good and relatively more of the cheaper good, which in this case is the reusable bottles. Right. So that's sort of an overview of how taxation affects the individual consumer. And then as we move forward, we'll talk about entire markets. But first, we'll take a look at the producer in the next video.